Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Christopher Belous, to talk about sex positivity and sex education. Dr. Belous has a Ph.D. and H.D.F.S. couple and family therapy from Michigan State University. He's also a certified sex therapist and a sex educator. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I notice you have some articles in the last couple years here. You co-authored the Sex Positivity Scale, a new way to measure sex positivity as a trait, and teaching sex therapy as a method of transformative learning.
Yeah.
So tell me about the sex positivity movement. What is that?
Sure. So it's a movement that incorporates elements from like media, sexual health, the idea of like having a satisfying and rewarding sex life for all people. And the whole point of the scale that I developed was really at the time, we didn't have any way of truly measuring what was sex positivity. We didn't know very much what sex positivity was. Everybody was throwing the word around, right? This phrase.
Yeah.
And what we wanted to do is we wanted to come up with a way to take a look at it and then be able to measure that over time so that way we could see what impact it has on people, relationships, our culture and society, different things like that.
So what definition have we settled on here? Where are we at?
Oh, there's too many, right? There's people way more famous than I that have come up with way more eloquent ways to describe what is sex positivity, I will say.
Yeah.
But for me, it incorporates, like I was saying, elements of sexual health. So like the positivity of like accessibility as well as, connections to different healthcare initiatives associated with like sexual expression, sexual safety. Then it also incorporates like attitudes, beliefs, values, communications, activities that you engage in, how you feel about sex and your sexual expression. So it's a very large construct, to use that term, which is a fancy way of saying basically just how it's all viewed and how it all comes together. And so the idea is that sex positivity is unique to each person. And by being unique to each person, what that can do is like you get the opportunity to develop what it is that sex positivity means for you in a way that is healthy within the connection of your relationships and for yourself.
So given that this definition is a movable feast, how do you measure it then?
So what I did was I looked at so there was a couple of different scales and there was like some theories, right, that looked at like what was called erotophobia and erotophilia. Okay.
You'll define those for us, I hope.
Yeah. Those two terms, like erotophilia was like just super like invested and wanting erotic concepts to be like open and unrestricted. Right? And then erotophobia was kind of exactly what it sounds like, the idea of almost an irrational fear of sex and sexuality or sex concepts. And so there was like a few things that really put it on this dichotomous scale, back and forth. But there wasn't anything that looked specifically at like attitudes, behaviors, the way that people communicated about sex. And all of the other scales were about dysfunction. Was what it was. So like it's either working or it's not working. Very dichotomous, right? Back and forth. And that just really wasn't like fitting the bill for trying to take a look at things like mental health or the way that like having a positive or healthy sex life integrates with who you are as a person or who you are in your relationship.
And I understand that you can actually trace this back to the 100 years ago to the 1920s.
Yeah.
And then there's another phase in the development of this concept in the 1960s with the free love movement, right?
Yes.
Tell me about the 1920s. What did it look like there?
So back then it was very fear-based. So it was either bad or it was good, and that was defined by social constructs at the time.
Okay.
Right? So that was looking at like, and a vast majority was that it was bad. Don't do it. Don't touch yourself. Don't touch other people. There was a lot of cultural elements that would talk about like waiting for marriage, and that sex was really a means to an end in order to procreate.
And this is coming out of the Victorian era, of course, right?
Yeah, of course. So it's coming like right out of that.
And now I know if we're comparing this to, we're talking about things opening up here and people having more of a positive attitude about it. I know that at least in Europe, there was a lot of openness. I
Yeah.
recently saw a movie called Lee, and it's about someone during that period, and it shows people having a picnic, and two of the women at the picnic are topless, and they're not having an orgy or anything. They're just
Yeah.
having a picnic, and they
Yeah,
decided
yeah,
to
yeah.
be topless. And I remember seeing that image. It was a Man Ray photograph that I'd seen, and it was about a photographer. Picasso was in this group, right? So it was about that artist group that was in and around Paris prior to World War II.
Yeah.
And they were very open and free sexually, apparently. So
Yeah.
is that what we're referring to when we talk about this movement kind of having its origins back then?
A bit, really, really sex positivity came really from the 1960s, and like the free love movement is where it kind of like sprang from and really came to be, because prior to that, there was, it was, I hate to say it this way, but most of what we know about sexuality was based in ignorance, and it wasn't really until the 1940s that we even started to fully learn about anything associated with like even sexual functioning, sexual beliefs, or activities that people engaged in. It was all basically like hearsay at that point. So back in the 1920s and then prior to that, there was a little bit in there, but there wasn't so much about sex positivity. It was about finding what was wrong. So it was more of a sex negative or a sex negativity movement. And then we went through the early parts of the 20th century, and eventually ended up in the 1960s, where people started to have all this energy and wanting to talk and share their sexuality with others. And that's where we got like body positivity, sex positivity, all of that. So what you're referencing to, like nudity and things like that, a while back in our history, that was never seen as a sexual experience, right? So more often than not, that was just a comfort level, and it wasn't until a reaction to, say, the 1960s and the free love movement and things like that, that we started to realize that, no, when we say modesty is a component, modesty as it relates to sex was more of a response to the sex positivity.
I see, yeah. And I know, looking at the 60s, I think a lot of people think of it as just hippies, in the park and all of that. But there were some very serious forums where they had meaningful discussions about this. It was a much broader issue than just what we think of when we think of the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we get to where we're at today?
Oh, well, basically, so this is a 3-hour conversation, is what I will say about that.
Let's do the abbreviated
The abbreviated version, yeah. So really in the 60s, people started to realize that their bodies were something that could be enjoyed. Is what it was, and they started to rebel against these ideas that it should be restricted, and that things about sexual expression should be reserved for committed relationships or marriages. And what that then resulted, and it had a lot to do, and it's had a lot of ties to things connected with like the way our society has advanced with like mechanics and industry and our general knowledge.
But in the 60s, there were still certain sexual experiences that were illegal.
Oh yeah, right? Well, and there's still a lot today. There's so many things on the book that make everything illegal.
I know in the 60s there were cases of people actually being arrested and prosecuted, but tell me that's not going on now, right?
Not nearly as much. They're still on the books, but they're like way far down the list. You're more likely to get arrested for jaywalking, or something than you are, for any of these other activities.
So what's the current focus then?
In terms of like sex positivity, you mean?
Yeah.
So really, it's still around, because of the current state of affairs across the world, but particularly here in the U.S., it's really moved into sexual health. Is what it's become, because sexual health is a major component of sex positivity. So that's talking about access to sexual health care, it's access to choices and freedoms associated with one's body, but also the choices and decisions that you make with that body in terms of sexual expression. So that's where we're at today.
And consent as well, right? That's another interesting take here.
Yeah, especially because like we've seen a lot, especially in our current cultural environment, where people have started to move backwards. Like there's been a lot of videos across media recently of even minors, for example, like in high schools and stuff, chanting, very not nice things, about, control over other people's bodies or making choices or lack of consent in terms of like, I don't need to ask for consent anymore, or things like that, which are atrocious.
And does that also cover these pictures that are being photographs? In other words, someone taking a picture of their sexual partner and the other person
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
know about it, or maybe they do know about it, but then the other
yeah.
party puts it on the internet. Is
Yeah,
that
it's called revenge porn.
revenge porn? Okay,
Revenge
so
porn.
what do you know about that?
Yeah, it's a violation of trust is really what it is. So a lot of couples or individuals will share videos, share pictures, they'll make videos or pictures together, and the expectation is an implicit expectation that it stays within the relationship unless there's other conversations that occur. But some people, they get upset and they think, what's one of the best ways that I can hurt somebody else? I'm going to shame them about sex. I'm going to shame them about enjoying their body. So then they'll post it online. And unfortunately, especially in many of the cultures around the world, but here in the U.S. especially, if you have nude photos online, you release a sex tape, unless you are already famous, it's going to be detrimental to you.
In some cases, if you're already famous, you may
You get
welcome
even more
it.
famous.
Yeah, because you're getting more
Yeah.
famous, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's a kind of a tragic thing for someone who doesn't want that to happen.
Yeah, and it comes back to the consent thing, right?
Right, well, that's why I brought it up, yeah.
Yeah, because nobody agreed to it being released in that way. You might have agreed to it being created, but you didn't agree to it being released.
Yeah. How often does that happen?
A lot more than it should, I will say. It's actually been decreasing over time because most adult websites or pornography websites have a lot of policy and procedures in place where people can declare and say, that's me in that video, I don't want that video online, and they'll have it removed very quickly. But just as all the mainstream ones have started to have those processes, there's actually new websites being developed that are dedicated solely to revenge porn.
The dark
as well,
web,
too.
right?
Yeah. So it is decreasing though.
So you're also involved with sex education.
Oh yeah.
How do you address that there? I mean, do you tell people, these relationships seem like they're going to last forever, but they don't often, and you should not put yourself in a situation where someone can take advantage of you, because you're kind of, if you do that, you're kind of, you're poisoning the relationship a little bit, right? How do you approach that?
So, one of the things is that you never want to take an approach where you kind of put fear or shame into a sexual act or a behavior, So some people really truly enjoy, taking videos or pictures or different things, and it's part of what is very satisfying for them in their sex life.
But if you're concerned about this getting out, you can never do that. It's a risk you can't take, right?
True. I think about this all the time. So I'm a sex therapist, right? Sex educator. I do things like this. I, talk to people about this stuff all the time. And I think to myself, I don't think I could ever run for office. Not that that's on my radar, but it's something where
at some point it could help you. You never know.
You never know. You have to think about all of these elements, and you have to think about the society that we live in and what that means. So when I engage with sex education with people, and this topic comes up, or in sex therapy when this topic comes up, I say be very clear. That's the number one thing. Be super clear. Communication is the key to sexual health, sex positivity, sexual satisfaction, all these things. We don't like to talk about sex. There's so much shame in it. But the more you talk about it, the safer it's going to be for you. And the more consent can play a part, and you can actually then have conversations with somebody. Then I can feel a little bit more safe and comfortable in that, as long as the other person
But you're
sticks
not,
to it.
right? I mean, even in a marriage, if you consent to photographs or videos or something, right? That marriage could break up. The person could want to get even with you. You've lost control over it, right? I mean,
and that's the downside, and that's what something I like to call the weaponization of sexuality, because our culture is still as sex positive as we're becoming and have become, and the free, all these different elements that have really drastically increased and opened up avenues for these conversations. We're still very sex negative. Across the board. You compare us to some European countries, most countries, or many countries around the world, you compare the US and the culture that we have here to it, and we're very far behind. And this is an example of that. When someone says, we're gonna get a divorce, and then I'm gonna release this tape, I'm gonna release these photos, all that's saying is that you should be ashamed of your sex. You should be ashamed that that happened, and now it's going to damage you everywhere else that you go.
There's that element to it, but I mean, still, I don't want pictures of myself made public, right? And I'm not necessarily because I'm ashamed of my sexuality or anything, but I should have a right to
Yeah,
decide that
absolutely.
or not. And I think
Absolutely.
it's problematic.
Oh, yeah.
If you're even in a very trusting relationship, right? If you go that direction.
Absolutely.
But getting back to just sexual education in general,
Yeah,
what are
yeah.
some other hot topics right now?
So a lot of the things that people want to talk about whenever I've done sex education with like minors. I've done it in public and private schools.
Yeah.
I do it with adults. I'm literally getting ready next semester to teach a course on sex therapy and sex education.
Yeah.
So, it really depends upon like which kind of group you're talking about. But when you bring minors into the equation,
Yeah.
the biggest and the largest hot topic there is about parental rights and their ability to make decisions for their youngsters about what information they're exposed to, what kind of information they're exposed to, what topics are brought up, how they're taught those topics. So. I know for me, one of the things that I do whenever I've done it is I have, obviously I have consent forms, but I also provide all the materials up front. I have informational seminars for the parents. And quite frankly, most of the time those turn into like sex education for the parents.
parents, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
more so than
I can
anything
see
else,
that,
you
yeah.
know. But then they realize
Because
that it's not so
people
scary.
don't find opportunities to talk about these things.
They don't, and that does come back to that communication thing. I wish that, like, one of my dreams is that I wish that, just like you have this, like, this roundtable perspective, right? Great show.
Thank you.
I wish that there was like a sex perspective in some way, or like something like that, because the idea of just continuing to have conversations around it and make it less taboo, but something that can be explored and valued for what it is. There are profound effects on the human body for having positive, healthy, satisfying sexual expression. You know, I mean, it can literally extend someone's life. You know, and so by talking about it, what we're doing is we're kind of letting it out of the shadows, which almost, I would argue, becomes kind of a public health issue.
Well, let's go back to what you were saying about working with children for a second.
Sure.
Are there circumstances where children are participating in these sex education classes and their parents haven't given permission or just don't know about it?
Well, if that were the case, then I would say whoever's providing that sex education is doing so unethically.
So there's no intent here to push this where, okay, so.
No, and so like, let me give you an example. So I was doing a workshop in a different state that I lived in, but it was more of a conservative leaning state in the South. And so I was doing this training in this school, and the school system said very specifically, like, you're gonna be working with third graders, which I was incredibly impressed with, because most people think of sex education, you think of like you're in, what, 6th grade, and you get your little stick of deodorant, and it's like, here you go, this is what puberty is, you know?
They didn't do this when I was at school.
Oh,
but I'm
that was
learning
my
about
sex
it now,
education, was here's a stick of deodorant,
okay.
don't get pregnant. And so, but I was going as low as 3rd grade, and I was doing it over a series. So I was doing 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and I was working my way up. And for 3rd graders, as an example, parents were afraid I was going to show them birthing videos or teach them how to use condoms or other methods of contraception. And no, the focus of sex education depends upon the developmental level of the person that you're working with. And so when I work with like a 3rd grader, 2nd grader, anybody who's younger and isn't necessarily hitting puberty or engaging in any kind of sexual acts, you know, they're going to need different kinds of information. They're going to need to know about sexual predators. They're going to need to know about safety. They're going to need to know about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, as well as like preparing for changes in their body that are upcoming, but just being aware and knowledgeable about what's happening. So all of it is really centering around, which includes sex positivity, which includes sexual health, which includes education and therapy, is all centering around de-shaming aspects. And that's what you were talking about with like talking about it. People need to talk about it more.
And then there's there's that issue of development and sexual health and things like that, right? How do you talk about those things with the 3rd grader, for instance, or don't you?
Yeah, no, you do. So you talk about how like bodies are getting ready to change. There's actually a whole setup in terms of like what's appropriate to talk about with various age settings, because our national organization, CCUS is the one that comes to mind, that gives you like a whole framework that says, developmentally, this is what's appropriate during this time frame. So let's focus on that. what are good questions to ask in terms of like needing to know and learning more about knowledge,
Yeah.
giving and providing accurate information in terms of like the age-old question of where do babies come from, being able to answer that from a sophisticated way.
Yeah. You know, in a broader way, and I don't know if this is talked about at all, but I think as a parent, and I raise 4 kids, you want to preserve the childhood experience, right? But the children want to be adults, right?
Yeah.
And so a big part of parenting is kind of holding them back a little bit and not letting them expose themselves to the things that they really want to know about, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that balance there?
Well, what we actually know from research is that if you hold them back, right, but you don't hold them back, you give them the information that they want to know, they're going to make better decisions. So actually, the age of the onset of when someone will have sex for the first time has drastically increased. And that's,
really?
Yeah, and that is because of the fact.
That surprises me.
That's what I was thinking too when I first
tell me
read
about it. What's the statistic on that?
So it used to be as early as like 14 and 15 people were having sex, and now it's ratcheted all the way up to 17 or 18. And that's because people are waiting longer to have sex because they know more of the consequences that could come from it, but they know about, and they're not as curious about it.
That's fascinating. That's not what I would have expected.
Yeah, it's honestly like with the more sex education, the more information that you can provide, the clearer you are about it, the less like, it's kind of like if I were to look at you and say, you can never go behind, you know, the studio here. You're gonna be real curious about what's behind the studio, right? Yeah. But if I tell you it's a bunch of cords back there, are you gonna wanna go back there and see a bunch of cords and dust?
Well, another element, I guess, is if you're telling them about it in school, they're going to think it's boring and they don't want to.
Oh yeah, not near as much. And if everybody knows about it,
and then you also deal with teaching sex therapy, right?
Yes, I do.
So how does, if someone's learning to be a sex therapist, right? What do you tell them that everybody doesn't know?
Well, the biggest thing that I like to talk about is that it should be funny. It should be funny.
Really?
Like, sex is hilarious if you think about it. Like, if objectively.
Not during sex.
Oh, well, sure, of
Really?
course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be funny. During, it can be funny. Afterwards, like, if you think about it, the faces that everybody makes, I mean, it is hilarious, like, start to finish, you know? But it's also like that's the best way to access and retain information is if you use humor, you know, and that's what I found through. You mentioned the study that I did in the paper that I wrote about teaching sex therapy.
Yeah.
The biggest outcome from that, and something that would be helpful for parents, friends, anybody who talks about sex, joke around about it.
Really?
Now, it's not to take away the seriousness of it, right? Because it is very serious, but it's okay to giggle, it's okay to laugh, and then talk about what that means and where that came from, right?
You're not suggesting that the people who are engaging in sex make jokes.
Well,
It's not part of the sex act.
Not necessarily
You're just talking
jokes.
about the therapist.
Yeah.
Here. Yes, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, it is funny though. Like, you know, I always like to tell the joke: if you haven't broken a bed, then have you ever really had sex? You know, or something like that. Because most people have somehow broken a bed, got something messed up, just purely by accident, right?
Yeah.
I get in trouble all the time at weddings I always go to, and I'm like, hope you break the bed tonight, you know, or something like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe I'm the only person that finds that funny. But the whole concept.
You're the only one who knows about that because nobody else is talking about it, right? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the whole concept of humor is that, especially in an education or learning about it, is that you're going to retain that information if you find it funny. And so it's taking the shame away from it. And
I'm sure that's the big part of it, right?
Yeah.
So do you have a list of jokes that you go through if you need to, which we won't be able to hear tonight, by the way.
Right. No, I'm not sure that would make it to air. But one of the things I do is I start off every class with they can ask any question that they may want to ask, and then I go around and I challenge at least one person in the classroom to come up with some kind of joke and tell that joke in front of everybody, because not only is it bringing that humor in, but it's also making it more comfortable for them to talk about sex.
Okay. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Christopher Belous for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.